Okay, now, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is the panel about why you should care about redistricting. My name is Rafi Friedman Gerspan, and I am a Deputy States Director with the All on the Line team. I am based in Washington, D.C., and I have the distinct pleasure of working with Lake Ashupek, our North Carolina State Director, who I just want to say at the top, massively proud of her doing this summit. There she is. So today, this morning, we're going to be having a conversation with some amazing folks. And I just want to name that I know one person is about to join us. So we're just going to start going ahead right now. So yeah, over the past decade, North Carolina has been the scene of major debates on issues ranging from race and community policing, access to reproductive health care and abortion, clean air and water, and equality and protections for LGBTQ people, especially transgender individuals. The General Assembly in Raleigh was either the instigator, the barrier, or the passive bystander in these divisive battles. And in the shadows lurked the specter of gerrymandered legislative districts. Gerrymandering enabled leaders in Raleigh to manipulate the playing field that these conflicts were being played out on. The purpose of this morning's discussion is to unpack and uncover the influence gerrymandering has had on issue advocacy in North Carolina over the past decade, how redistricting in 2021 will set the stage for either progress or continued stagnation on issues deeply personal to the folks in the Tar Heel state. And very importantly for all of you joining us this weekend, how you as supporters of the All on the Line campaign in North Carolina can stay involved with some of our closest partner organizations represented here today, advocating simultaneously for justice and progress, as well as fair redistricting maps. We are joined by four incredible, tireless advocates from major organizations in North Carolina who have worked for change for over the past decade. First, Susanna Birdsong is the North Carolina Director of Public Affairs at Planned Parenthood South Atlantic. For more than a century, people have relied on Planned Parenthood for accessible and affordable quality healthcare, accurate information, and comprehensive health education. Planned Parenthood South Atlantic offers a wide range of affordable and reliable reproductive and sexual health care services throughout North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia. Next, Rashad Gibson is a grassroots community organizer who works at the North Carolina League of Conservation Voters as Canvas Director, overseeing the voter registration program in the Triad area of North Carolina. NCLCV's mission is to protect the health and quality of all North Carolinians by electing environmental champions, advocating for environmental policies that protect communities, and hold elected leaders accountable for their decisions. Ames Simmons is the policy director at Equality North Carolina. Equality North Carolina is the oldest statewide organization in the United States dedicated to securing rights and protections for the LGBTQ community. With the goal to build a better North Carolina for all, Equality NC works to ensure that every North Carolinian sees themselves in the LGBTQ movement and helps make a safer, more equitable world for all marginalized folks. And last but not least, Jessica Turner is a board member of the Raleigh Police Accountability Community Task Force, Raleigh Pact, and is also voting registration coordinator at Blueprint North Carolina. Raleigh Pact is a coalition of community-based groups, leaders, and nonprofit organizations committed to human rights that formed in 2015. The coalition sees urgent need for accountability, equity, and transparency in policing in the city of Raleigh, and works to educate community members about their rights and to end racial profiling, selective enforcement, and excessive force and harassment by police. Thank you to all of you for joining us this morning. I am very much looking forward to this conversation. And I know that Leica and our team in North Carolina for All on the Line has been working with you all. And I'm sure folks in the audience are very much aware of a lot of the work that you already are doing. But to start off the conversation, I want to talk to each of you about a little bit of the context that we're operating in terms of the issues that you're focused on, but also with the backdrop of gerrymandering and the upcoming redistricting process. So I'm first going to start with Susanna. Susanna, abortion providers and advocacy groups sued North Carolina's top lawmakers last year in state court, saying that a mandatory waiting period and other restrictions passed years ago violate residents' constitutional rights. North Carolinians have experienced decades of attacks on reproductive rights and family planning, particularly in rural and communities of color. I'm wondering if you could help us understand what the state of play is right now in those battles, and importantly, how legislative gerrymandering has played a significant role in preventing access to reproductive care.
Yeah, of course. And thanks so much for having me, y'all. It's great to be with you this morning. So I think it is absolutely true that that legislative gerrymandering has had a dramatic impact on access to reproductive health care, especially in the last decade, when we have seen really a cascade of restrictions on access to that care being passed and becoming law in our state. As Rafi mentioned, we challenged several of those in state court this past September, but as we all know, litigation takes more than a minute. And so that case is really just in its infancy still. We are still waiting on the very first hearing, which will hopefully be coming in March. But I think to really think about how gerrymandering has impacted this issue, I look at the polling and what we see in North Carolina in terms of public opinion on this issue. And so we know that the most recent poll was in August of 2020, and it really reflected polls that had been done the year before and the year before and the year before that show that the vast majority of North Carolinians support access to reproductive health care, including abortion, and think that that is a decision that is best left up to the patient and their loved ones and their doctor, and that politicians do not have a place or a role in that decision-making process. And yet, so the number in North Carolina is 74% of North Carolinians support access to reproductive health care without government interference. And yet, we know that these restrictions keep passing by a legislature that is not, elected to listen to the vast majority of North Carolinians or really cares that much about what the vast majority of North Carolinians want and need. And so in the face of that, what we've seen pass, especially in the last 10 years, are restrictions that are the very ones that we've challenged in the state court case, including a 72-hour mandatory delay before someone can access abortion care. And this is one of the longest waiting periods in the country. We are one of only 6 states that has a waiting period of this length. And when you think about how demeaning it really is to tell someone once they've decided to access healthcare that they want and need, that they have to wait 3 days before they can access it to make sure that they're actually sure. There is no other medical procedure where people are subjected to that kind of waiting period, to that kind of just demeaning tactic. And so other bans that have been put in place in the last several years are things like, we have a ban right now on access to abortion via telemedicine. And especially in this pandemic moment that we find ourselves in, that one feels especially cruel, because if you are in the early stages of pregnancy and can access a medication abortion, that is something that can be prescribed to you. And you can be counseled on how to take that medication. just as we are doing here over Zoom, over the telephone, and you don't necessarily need to go into a clinic to have somebody watch you take a pill. But in North Carolina, that's what we require people to do right now because we know that that restricts access. And I'll just close by saying we know that all of these restrictions that have been put in place in recent years have a disparate impact on people of color, on low income people, on young people, and on people in the rural parts of our state. And that is why we are challenging several of them in this new state court case. Because in the face of legislative inaction, we know that these restrictions are hurting people every day, and they have to go.
Thank you. Very important. And I think that's so important to underscore the impact on marginalized communities, in particular communities of color and those living in rural parts. I like to often say, and Lake has heard me say this, that I think of North Carolina as a little bit of America in miniature in terms of just the types of communities, the geography that's there. And our next panelist, Rashad, good morning.
Good morning.
I would love to ask you, as someone who's working on the front lines of environmental justice work, environmental injustice and racism have been major problems facing primarily Black and Brown rural communities in North Carolina for decades. And in particular, knowing about poisoning on hog farms, the Gen X chemical contamination in the Cape Fear watershed, of course, the lack of action on climate change, which really threatens the low-lying areas on the coastal waterways and inland waterways too, all have, of course, deep roots in inaction by a passive and sometimes outright hostile legislature in Raleigh. So I'm wondering if you could help us, Rashad, understand how these examples are rooted in the lack of community voice and decision making in the state capitol. And what are you all at NCLCV doing about that?
Yes, well, happy to be here. Being able to work on the front lines, and of course, in the past 2 cycles, being able to oversee large scale voter registration, and particularly having a heavy focus in the eastern part of the state, I've got to know the people very well, and you get to see the impacts firsthand. I think we all know the devastation that they face with the hurricanes, just the veracity of them, the intensity because of climate change, and what that's meant for the communities. Folks that have worked with us on the program, as well as the people we've been building with, I've actually been able to see it. The process of trying to evacuate some of these folks out that work for us, even to this day, figuring out ways in which we can assist folks that just don't know what to do. And that's because they don't feel like there is a place where people are working with them for solutions. And that's something, having the fair fight, having those, looking at gerrymandering in ways that can span, actually have a voice. The folks, they're true leaders. They're key to what North Carolina can actually be. They just need to have that voice. And being able to work with them every day with this voter registration, looking towards organizing and building towards those solutions, those are things that we need to look at. But we don't want to just look at it as having to fight for this. We want people that are fighting for us. And that's one of the key things that we're trying to do with the programs we're lifting up now. We started out with very large voter registration programs. And that can be a transactional process in a lot of ways, but we tried to build the culture of inclusiveness and connection past that with the leadership development. So what NCLCV is doing now is we're working on organizing, actually hearing those voices, lifting those voices up, saying, how do you feel about climate change? How has it impacted you? Where are you at with that now? How can we work with you to create the solution that you want to see? So together, I think building those concrete solutions, looking at clean energy democracy, folks in those communities, they don't have a lot, it's hard for jobs, right? So how can we look at clean energy? How can we create jobs that they can actually have and be good for the environment? So figuring out those solutions and building together something is a priority for us.
Thank you. So important, especially in the context of making sure that people feel validated and included in their communities, and really an underscore about also, I love that you touched on jobs, and as we know right now in the pandemic world that we're in, job security is so vulnerable right now. And if I can pivot to Ames, one of the major things that your organization has been doing for decades is making sure that basic protections like job security and employment non-discrimination are protected for the LGBTQ community there in North Carolina. As we all know, North Carolina received unprecedented attention in 2016 when the General Assembly passed the infamous HB2 bill, dubbed the bathroom bill, which was a blatant assault on human rights and constitutional rights of transgender North Carolinians and people visiting from outside the state, such as myself, being a trans woman. It was signed into law by the former governor and led to significant public backlash, including a nationwide boycott of the state. Obviously, since that time, some of the most restrictive provisions of that law were repealed. And I know recently, this past December, municipalities were finally, thank goodness, released from prohibitions of passing LGBTQ protective city ordinances. But Ames, I'm wondering if you could talk to us about the state of play right now and what concerns remain, especially as we go into this redistricting year.
Thank you, Rafi, and thanks for having me on this panel with people who I so much admire. You're right, about 6 weeks ago, Section 3 of HB 142, which was the law that fake repealed HB 2, sort of just left some of the really poisonous pieces of it in place. Section 3 of that law expired. It enabled municipalities to be able to protect residents from discrimination in private employment and public accommodations. And importantly, cities were completely preempted from being able to protect any of their residents and workers. This was not something that was limited to members of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community. So many municipalities have now responded by beginning to enact those ordinances. So this past week, we had a wave of 3 municipalities, starting with Hillsborough, followed by Carrboro and Chapel Hill, enacting ordinances to protect their folks in employment and in public places and spaces. And we expect to see at least 2 more in the coming week with the city of Durham and with Orange County, which is where, for example, UNC Chapel Hill is located. So right now we're talking about primarily the research triangle, the triangle as we call it, which is like Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill, and is thought of as like a more politically progressive enclave. And I think that's made people think it's led people to employ a really facile surface analysis that says like, oh, urban places are places that are safe and that care about LGBTQ people, and rural places are not. And I just want to dispel some of that miseducation that's taking place, because of course there are LGBTQ people all across North Carolina, and the fact that there continues to be preemption of regulation of restrooms, the General Assembly has reserved to itself the right to regulate restrooms and has not yet put any protections in place. So they simply have said, we're not going to do anything, but we're also not going to allow anyone else to do anything. And laws that restrict people's access to restrooms affect our ability to participate in public life. Laws that, like HB2 and HB 142, just they serve to inspire fear, particularly in the trans community. I'm a queer, white, transgender guy myself. I'm nervous in using restrooms at the General Assembly myself. And just like Susanna said, they either don't care about that or they're intentionally trying to prevent access for people who are most affected by the policies that they pass from actually being able to play a role in those policies. And the kinds of policies that the NCGA is enacting that Rashad has referred to, for example, we know disproportionately affect people who are most marginalized in our communities. And I just want to hold up that we know that people of color in particular continue to disproportionately be subject to harassment and discrimination and violence in our state, including this is a difficult moment, so folks take a breath, but I want to say the names of the Black trans women who have been murdered in North Carolina just since I've been here in 2017. That's Sherelle Faulkner, Dorica Banner, Chanel Scurlock, Bubba Walker, and Monica Diamond. And many of those women lived around Charlotte, but Chanel, for example, lived in the east part of North Carolina. So this is not something, again, that is a rural urban divide. So we've been involved in Fair Maps advocacy all along because it's a key part of enabling people in our community to be able to share power with the people who are controlling that power. And it's this is going to be a really key year as the census results are analyzed and maps get drawn here.
Thank you, Ames, and thank you for saying their names. That's very important. And of course, you know, pivoting over to Jessica, you know, one of the things as someone who is a trans woman of color and seeing the type of policies that Ames was talking about being, you know, enacted in North Carolina and knowing the vicious history, of course, of racism, but also of, in particular, police brutality in cities like Charlotte and Raleigh. I remember, for example, in 2016, because this got national attention way before, of course, some of the more recent, you know, unfortunate situations, but of the loss of Brother Keith Lamont Scott. And ultimately, there was no conviction there. And I'm wondering, even though that was in the city of Charlotte, I'm wondering if you could talk to us, Jessica, about what Raleigh Pact has been doing before then, since that time, in terms of bringing the urgent attention to the matters of racial justice and police accountability. And really, you know, where do you see, because we're talking about the legislature here, are we ever going to be in a situation where the NCGA can pass comprehensive police accountability laws, given how gerrymandered the institution is? What can be done?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I'm really honored to be among all of these people who I know pretty well. And so really kind of going back, as people have said, Raleigh Pact has been working to get accountability for the police in Raleigh since 2015. Our executive director, Rolanda Bird, her son was actually killed by Raleigh police in February of 2016. And so she has been just fighting ever since then for her son and for other people, loved ones that have been killed or even just brutalized by the police, because there are definitely moments of police violence where the person does not die, but they are still brutalized at the hands of the police. And so what we've been doing at Raleigh Pact, we have been very hyper-focused because policing is a very localized issue. It's city by city, county by county. And so we have been hyper-focused on Raleigh, the Raleigh Police Department, and Raleigh City Council as well. And so we do kind of a variety of things in that area. First and foremost, community education. A lot of people, particularly in Raleigh, don't know a lot about the police department or their interactions with them, don't have that many interactions. When we know that there are certain parts of Raleigh that are over police, right? And people are having a lot of interactions with the police all the time. And so part of our education that we do in the community is really educating people about the history of policing, telling them about the way that they police in Raleigh and the disparities that we see, as well as really educating people about the inherent anti-Blackness in policing. So at Raleigh Pact, we talk about defunding the police. And a lot of people are like, oh no, what do you mean when you say defund the police? Because their idea of safety is a cop with a gun will keep us safe, or a person with a gun will keep us safe. And what we say at Raleigh Pact is that we have to rethink, what does safety mean? Because safety means different things to different people. And so we need to broaden that understanding of what safety means. And so we do talk to people about, what does it mean to take money from the police and put it into education and put it into community centers for people, to put it into job, helping people find jobs, to put it into other community services for if someone is having, going through a mental crisis, that they send someone out that's trained to help them. Instead of sending out a police officer with a gun. And so we talk about doing things like that, and how important that is in our communities, and really walking people through. When you look at the history of policing, its inherent anti-Blackness, that is what we're talking about. We're talking about defunding the police and investing in communities. So we do a lot of just education to bring people in, for them to understand really what we're talking about when we talk about the system of policing in America. We also are continually at City Council, speaking at City Council. I'm sure they are tired of seeing our faces all the time, but reminding them and reminding our City Council and elected officials that you all have the power to make these changes, and not for them to kind of get elected and then think, oh, everything's fine, let's focus on development instead of our police department. And then I would say finally, another thing that we do that is a little bit more behind the scenes, but is really crucial. We assist families that have had, if them or their loved ones have had an experience with the police, whether that is they've just been brutalized or unfortunately their loved one has passed. We help them go through the process of filing a grievance or getting more information on that case. That can be a pretty intense process, and people don't know, where do I go? What forms do I fill out? What do I do when they tell me, they try to tell me no. And so we actually have a system where we help families as well, try and get more information about the incident as well. And so that's something that we try to do to support families and loved ones that have experienced kind of police brutality. So that's kind of a little bit about the things that we do in a nutshell. And I think when it comes to redistricting, one of the things in the NCGA is one of the things that we advocate for and we push for at PACT is we really want an oversight board for Raleigh that has investigatory, subpoena, and disciplinary power, because we really believe that while changing policies are really great, if there's no accountability or no kind of teeth behind it, officers can continue to break policies or go against the policies of the department with really no repercussions. And so because of the way that our state is set up, we are a Dillon's rule state, which means that the NCGA, municipalities can pass ordinances, but the NCGA can override them. And so we have been working really with the Wake County delegation to get a local acts bill, which would then be able for our city council to create an oversight board that we are recommending. And so that is kind of how our work intersects with the NCGA. And so when it comes to redistricting and fair maps, we know that if we can get redistricting and fair maps, we can get better representation of our communities in the NCGA, and then we'd be more likely to be able to get this bill passed so that we can have an oversight board in Raleigh.
Thank you, Jessica, and so important what you all are doing in Raleigh. And of course, this goes back to an earlier point that Susanna raised, which is that what we are seeing is that so many folks out in North Carolina and of course across the country care about these issues, but because and want urgent action, but we aren't able to get across the line because of those exact type of rules, right? Like the Dillon's rule there, where the legislatures have put themselves in a position of preventing progress. And of course, because of the way that lines have been manipulated, from a decade ago, and now we're seeing how the teeth are sort of clenching in on these issues. And I think the next question I have for the group, and really popcorn style, is what can our supporters of All on the Line, how can they get involved? But I want to name something that's very important as a community advocate myself, is that often there is a little bit of a misunderstanding about allyship, I think on a variety of different issues that we're talking about here, about the importance of not necessarily speaking or acting for, but rather with communities. And I think this in particular, I'm thinking, Rashad, of some of the communities that you work with out in the eastern part of the state, who often, I think, you know, probably are being mischaracterized sometimes by folks in those urban parts of the state. And I want to make sure that we're underscoring the importance of speaking with communities, not for. So anyone here, please jump in. But really, it's like, what can our folks who are joining for redistricting, how can we also be doing the work with you all simultaneously? Anyone, or I'll call on someone.
So I'll start to just express appreciation to Julianne for putting the link to ncisready.org in the comments, because this is what how I was planning to respond to this question, is that individuals can be in contact with their local legislators, and organizations can join us as coalition partners in doing this work. Along the theme of we keep us safe and focusing on community, our Equality NC is also having our MLK observance this year. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, the observance is Monday. We are participating in a mutual aid effort with QTPOC of Carborough and Chapel Hill, and that is queer and trans Indigenous people of color. And you can contribute to their mutual aid fund through Equality NC's website. The theme here, I think, is that when trust is undermined in institutions, folks tend to turn to neighbors first, and making sure that community solutions are the ones that are being lifted up and listened to by lawmakers.
Rashad, I see you unmuted yourself. I wasn't sure.
Yes. I think one of the biggest things, and that's a great point, community voices are so important. As I said, we've been building out large-scale voter registration since 2014, but we also seen the importance of digging deep, really lifting up those voices, hearing the solution that folks need to have. So I think one way in which you can support NCLCV and the work we're doing, of course, nclcvf.org. You can learn more about the work that we're doing. But just, you know, for us, we took an approach that we want people to be leaders themselves, right? We want to spark the interest in them talking to folks on their own. And one of the things that was good for us is continue to talk to your neighbors, continue to talk to your community members, let them know about being registered to vote, making sure you're creating plans when it's time to vote, and understanding that it goes past the ballot. I think that's one of the key things I want to say. It does not stop once you cast your vote. It's the accountability. It's to continue to build and create leadership, because you have the biggest stake in seeing how you want your community, your state to be. So I think having that piece with you is so important, and being able to connect us on a level with a voter registration, education, and being able to have that outreach is so important for us.
Susanna, I wasn't sure if you were going to jump in, but we do have a question. I'm going to pivot a little bit to the chat that's going on. Really great discussion happening. But one of the questions I see is, how do we build sort of a year-round support, you know, making sure that it's not just a seasonal thing that I think a lot of us who work in elections and politics, sometimes we think there's an off season. And of course, with redistricting in particular, being every 10 years, this pops up. So what can folks do to really make sure that, you know, of course, they're advocating for things like you know, access to reproductive care, but also simultaneously, you know, speaking about the importance of redistricting?
I think it's a great point that Rashad made about it doesn't end at the ballot box. And in fact, it starts there. And then, you know, thinking about everything that comes after that in terms of we are entering just this week, our legislature came back into session, entering our long session, which will run from now until who knows, later this summer, hopefully. And so, you know, it's a long slog and there's a lot to pay attention to, and you can get lost in the onslaught. But I think just encouraging folks as much as you are able to in this time when we are all feeling the weight of so many things, to just stay engaged and stay in tune and in touch with organizations that are represented here and others who will be letting you know early and often about things that are happening in the NCGA. It's a really complicated time to be involved in advocacy work, because it's not like we can do things that we are used to doing, like big lobby days, and meeting with your legislator in person is not an option in the way that it was in non-pandemic times. And so, thinking about ways that we can still encourage engagement and for folks to reach out via phone, via text, via email, via, small Zoom meeting with legislators. We are thinking about all of that right now. And so we just really appreciate continued support and attention as we are going through these next many months together, when there will be so many things pulling us in different directions.
Thank you. I just want to give folks who are listening in the opportunity. We have about 5 minutes left in case you want to throw any questions into the chat for our panelists. I do have a question about, for the group, while we're waiting for that, about what are the, if progress was made on redistricting, if gerrymandering was gone, I mean, what kinds of, if we maybe popcorn style this, what kind of like 2-3 things in your space would immediately potentially open, the opportunity for change? So maybe starting with Jessica, if that rule was not in place there, what's the potential?
Yeah, I think that the potential, if we had fairer maps, what is that we could get an oversight board that has investigatory, subpoena, and disciplinary power. And so we could actually hold our police accountable for when they are brutalizing or killing members of our community. And so it would be, we would have the ability to hold our police officers accountable. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing that would change in the area of Raleigh Pact.
Anyone next? If not, also, there was a question, and this might be a good way of talking about this. In a state with so many intentional roadblocks, how do we make sure that there isn't activist burnout and that we're actually making a difference? But I think talking about potential, for me at least, is really good about like trying to overcome some of that burnout. But anyone, please, on our panel.
I think one of the most important things that we've began to do at NCLCV in regards to our work is we have to really push, because you look at how many organizers you can have, it's not but so many of us, right? And I think it's how we're being effective in the community folks, training them up, giving them leadership development skills, and actually spreading that out and having that empowerment where folks are really having these conversations and finding ways to it's not onus on you, how you're actually building up folks. So I think that's important for us to remember, is we have great leaders out there in the community. We got to make sure they're trained up and they can be a big push and part of the fight.
Great, absolutely. Just to, I know there's some questions about, for folks who are unable to join us today, whether this is going to be recorded. It is, I believe, especially because we are using Facebook Live, and certainly I imagine Leica, who will join us in a little bit to give us next steps in the rest of the day. We will absolutely make sure that this fabulous panel, that the recording is shared with folks. We do have one question about how would the type of candidate change if we have fair maps? And anyone here, but just thinking about, again, that hope of possibility, if we could, eradicate some of the worst aspects of map manipulation. And again, to anyone.
I'll jump in there. this is an exciting thought to me, to have candidates who really listen to and respect the priorities and needs of their constituents across the state, based on fair maps and fair districts, would be amazing to see legislators who are really listening and taking to heart what their constituents want and need.
Yeah. And Ames, I know that in our LGBTQ community, that has been a major thing, at all levels, local to national, sort of the so-called rainbow wave that has happened. But I think per this conversation, making sure that historically marginalized voices also are able to run in competitive districts, right, wherever they may be.
Yes, I think this past election was the first time that I think we had openly transgender candidates that were running for statewide office. And the environment of celebrating activism and participation in democracy gave rise to the election of folks like Braxton Winston, who's really rooted in community efforts to organize, and I think when that happens, we can really push back on the kind of preemption that Jessica is talking about, where the legislature might be less motivated to simply continue to pull more power toward itself and away from cities, and that might enable things like Medicaid to expand. It might lead to things like unemployment insurance to be fixed here, both of which are key responses to the pandemic that we haven't seen yet here. And of course, if we can work towards statewide non-discrimination, all of those things help to redistribute power in our state.
Thank you. Well, I am a little bit sad that I have to stick to time here. We've got a full day, but this has been just a fantastic panel. I want to say to all the North Carolinians out there listening, it is so clear that you have incredible leaders, heroes that are leading the causes that they work on. And of course, in the collective of human rights and the prosperity for all. I feel so confident in the future with these folks at the helm, and also knowing the communities that they are working to uplift the voices, and hopefully through the coordination of work with folks like Leica, with All on the Line, we're going to be able to actually see some of those things that we just talked about, because that's exactly what we're fighting for, which is fair lines, fair districts. And I'm going to pivot now over to Leica, but really just want to thank again the panelists for joining us. And Leica, what do we have coming up next?
Yeah, so our next panel starting at 10 is going to be, it's actually a presentation from Stacey Carlis, who's the Executive Director of North Carolina Census Counts Coalition, and she's going to give us sort of a lowdown of what happened with the 2020 census, where are we now, what happened specifically in North Carolina. I think this is something that we've gotten a ton of questions about just even over the past few sessions, and something that's really impactful obviously on the redistricting process. So I hope everyone can join us for that. And basically what's going to happen now is we'll close out this session, and so we'll end this webinar, but you'll be using the exact same link to get to go to Stacey's session. And basically what'll happen is you'll get like a little message that says like waiting to be let in. And that just means that we're talking to Stacey and making sure she's got her PowerPoint set up and all of that stuff. And so you'll be let in as soon as we're ready at 10 a.m. So please join us for that. I think it's going to be really interesting. And I know that people out there have a ton of questions about census stuff. So I think that'll be great. And again, thank you to Ames and Susanna and Rashad and Jess. Just this has been a really great panel. And of course, I always really appreciate our partners coming out for something like this, especially at 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning.
Thanks so much, y'all. Okay,
Great
thank you.
to be with you.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.